Hello there, my fellow traveler through these final moments of the day. Here I am again, your companion in the art of discovering those forgotten fragments of history, the pieces that hardly anyone remembers. Yet they're the most intimate building blocks of everyday life, surprisingly familiar and close to home. The night has settled around you now, hasn't it? All the worries, all the bustling chaos of a long day. Just let them drift away, as gently as your breath in this very moment. Your room right now feels so wonderfully cozy. That pillow beneath your head, perfectly soft. And you're searching for something gentle enough to carry you into sleep, yet just interesting enough to let your mind wander a little before completely letting go. If that's what you're looking for, then you found exactly the right place. Tonight, we won't be talking about thunderous battles, legendary kings, or inventions that changed the world. No. We'll be exploring something far more ordinary than that. Things that are perhaps even more boring in the most wonderfully mundane way. Things you've probably never thought to wonder about, yet they hide entire stories about how we humans have lived, how we've struggled with the most basic needs. Have you ever found yourself in some absent morning moment, holding your modern toothbrush in your hand and wondering, before these soft bristles existed, before those minty fresh tubes of toothpaste, what exactly did our distant ancestors do to keep their teeth? Let's generously call it clean. It sounds a bit peculiar, doesn't it? Not exactly the most inspiring question for an evening that calls for peace and quiet. But trust me, the answer might just surprise you a little. And perhaps you'll find yourself appreciating that simple toothbrush of yours more than ever before. Tonight, we'll travel back together through time to those misty dawns of humanity when the very concept of dental hygiene was still, well, incredibly primitive. We'll discover what those first humans used before toothbrushes even existed. And I must warn you in advance, it's not pretty. It really wasn't beautiful at all. And we won't stop there. We'll also visit a few other hidden corners of daily life from the past. Those small, seemingly insignificant details that reveal how ingeniously, and sometimes desperately, people had to adapt and create just to survive and find comfort, however small. Picture yourself now, nestled deeper into that warm blanket, eyes gently closed, and let this voice guide you. You don't need to try to remember everything. Don't need to analyze. Just listen and allow those images from the past to slowly appear in your mind like old faded film reels, soft and dreamlike. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, these historical discoveries unlike any other, feel free to leave a like or subscribe to the channel so we can continue this journey together through other sleepless nights. But that's tomorrow's concern. Right now. Right now, just let your mind be free. Take a deep, slow breath and exhale even more slowly. Feel that pleasant heaviness of your body gradually sinking into the mattress. The space around you is growing quieter. There's only this voice and these ancient stories. We're about to embark on a gentle adventure together into the land of things that are boring, yet surprisingly fascinating. Are you ready? Whether you're nodding along or already drifting, our journey is about to begin. And if this voice or these stories happen to carry you into sleep before we reach the end, well, that would be my greatest success of all. wishing you the most peaceful start to the most restful night's sleep. Now, let's begin with our first chapter, a glimpse into a world before the very idea of a toothbrush had even begun to take shape. Imagine, if you will, you're not here in this comfortable room, but standing in the middle of a dense forest or across a vast rolling plain, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years ago. The only light after sunset might come from the flickering glow of a campfire or pale moonlight filtering through leaves. The sounds around you aren't the hum of traffic or the neighbor's television, but the gentle chirping of crickets, the rustle of wind through ancient trees, and perhaps the distant growl of some hunting creature far off in the darkness. Life then was an endless series of efforts simply to survive, finding food, avoiding predators, enduring harsh weather. There were no supermarkets, no refrigerators, not even a proper roof in the way we understand it today. In that context, healthcare was an almost unimaginable luxury. People might get injured, fall ill, and often they could only rely on luck, natural resilience, or folk remedies passed down by word of mouth, with questionable effectiveness at best. And you know what? One of the most common, persistent, and agonizing health problems our ancestors had to face was dental problems. Think about what they ate, not the soft, carefully processed foods we're used to. Their diet consisted mainly of whatever they could hunt and gather. That might be wild game meat, tough and stringy, requiring tremendous chewing. Sometimes the meat would be mixed with sand and dirt, depending on how they prepared their catch on the ground. Can you imagine that texture? That feeling of sand grinding between your teeth? There were roots and tubers they had to dig from the earth. These were often hard, fibrous, and inevitably came with traces of soil still clinging to them. Nuts and hard seeds were also part of their diet. To eat these, teeth had to work incredibly hard, and the risk of chipping or breaking a tooth was very real. And then, when agriculture began to emerge, humans started eating more grains. While these provided valuable starches, they also fermented easily in the mouth, creating acids that corroded tooth enamel, especially when these grains were roughly processed, leaving plenty of debris stuck in the crevices between teeth. Imagine eating a meal like that. Stringy, chewy meat, hard nut fragments, gritty root vegetables, all of it getting lodged between your teeth, coating their surfaces, and there was nothing to easily remove it all. Sugar? Well, there certainly wasn't refined sugar like we have today. But honey, ripe sweet fruits, these were also hidden enemies of teeth if not cleaned away. How do we know this? Archaeological researchers, when studying ancient human skeletons, have found overwhelming evidence. Teeth worn down severely, sometimes down to the very pulp. Can you imagine the constant throbbing pain when teeth were ground down to that extent? Just a breath of cold air would be enough to make you wince. Countless cases of tooth decay, deep, dark cavities eating into the tooth itself. No painkillers, no dentist to fill them back up. Toothaches must have been a persistent nightmare. Gum disease and inflammation were also extremely common. Red, swollen, bleeding gums, receding gum lines, exposing tooth roots. Teeth would become loose and eventually fall out. Losing teeth at a relatively young age was not unusual at all. Tooth abscesses, infected pockets of pus forming at the tooth roots due to bacterial infection. These could cause facial swelling, high fevers, and if unlucky, the infection could spread, sometimes even leading to death. A single little cavity could potentially bring such a tragic end. Scientists have even found scratch marks and scrape marks on ancient teeth, showing that people back then tried to treat themselves. Perhaps they used some sharp object to try to remove trapped food or to relieve pressure when teeth became swollen and infected. Desperate, painful attempts at self-care. Put yourself in the position of someone living at that time. After a meal full of tough, stringy foods, the feeling of food debris still stuck in your mouth must have been incredibly uncomfortable, right? It wasn't just the physical annoyance, but also the smell. Bad breath was a barrier to communication, even in those most primitive times. They probably noticed that too. And then the pain. A constant dull toothache could ruin an entire day of hunting, or make it impossible to focus on anything else. It affected their ability to eat, weakened their health, and diminished their quality of life, which was already brutally harsh. It was from these persistent discomforts, from this instinctive need to remove whatever was causing irritation and pain in the mouth, that humans began to find ways, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes more deliberately. The need to clean teeth and mouth, though not yet given a name, was slowly beginning to take shape. They might have rinsed their mouths with plain water. A simple action, but one that could remove some food particles. But plain water alone wasn't enough. They might have used their tongues, their fingers, trying to clean their teeth. But fingers were too big to get into the narrow spaces between teeth, and tongues had their own limitations. So, when fingers weren't enough, when plain water couldn't reach everything, what did they turn to? What homemade tools emerged from that urgent need? The nature around them, with countless plants, branches, stones. Did it provide them with some emergency solutions? In our next chapter, we'll pull back the curtain of mystery together, looking directly at the tools our ancestors used to cope with their dental woes. And as I mentioned, some of these methods might make you shudder just a little. But that's history for you. Honest, and sometimes not particularly pleasant. Just relax now. Breathe steadily, and let your imagination lead the way. We're about to step into a world of prehistoric dental solutions. A world before toothbrushes ever existed. Let's paint this picture together now. You're standing there, not in this warm, comfortable room, but in the middle of a thick, untamed forest, or perhaps across an endless grassland, stretching far beyond what your eyes can see, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago. The only light after darkness falls might be the dancing glow of a small campfire, its flames flickering and casting long, wavering shadows, or perhaps just the pale, silvery moonlight filtering through the canopy above. The sounds surrounding you aren't the familiar hum of traffic or the neighbor's late-night television, but rather the soft, rhythmic chirping of insects, the gentle whoosh of wind moving through tall grasses, and maybe, just maybe, the distant, low rumble of some predator prowling far off in the night. Life during those times was one continuous chain of efforts simply to survive another day. Finding enough food to keep hunger at bay, avoiding the many dangerous animals that saw humans as potential prey, enduring the harsh bite of winter cold, or the scorching heat of summer with little more than animal skins for protection. There were no grocery stores with neatly stocked shelves, no refrigerators humming quietly in the corner, not even what we would recognize today as a proper shelter with solid walls and a roof. In that context, the idea of healthcare was almost unimaginably luxurious. People might suffer injuries from hunting accidents or falls. They might develop mysterious illnesses, and most of the time, they could only rely on sheer luck, their body's natural ability to heal itself, or perhaps some herbal remedies passed down through generations by word of mouth, remedies whose effectiveness was, well, often more hope than science. Picture the uncertainty of never knowing if tomorrow would bring food or famine, safety or sudden danger. Every sunrise was both a gift and a challenge. Every meal was precious, every injury potentially life-threatening. The concept of visiting a doctor for a routine checkup, of taking medicine for minor aches and pains, of having any kind of medical intervention, these were impossibilities beyond their wildest imagination. And yet, among all the countless health challenges our ancestors faced, broken bones from hunting accidents, infections from cuts and scrapes, illnesses brought on by contaminated water or spoiled food, you know what one of the most common, most persistent, and most genuinely agonizing problems turned out to be? Dental problems. Think about it for a moment. These weren't people who lived for just a few years and then disappeared. Many of them lived for decades, chewing and grinding and wearing down their teeth day after day, year after year, with no understanding of what we now call dental hygiene. Their teeth had to last them their entire lives, with no replacement, no repair, no relief from pain except what nature might provide. Now, let's consider what filled their daily meals. This wasn't the soft, carefully processed, pre-cut food that we're accustomed to today. Their diet consisted almost entirely of whatever they could successfully hunt down or gather from the wild around them. Picture this: wild game meat, the flesh of deer, wild boar, mammoth, or smaller creatures they managed to trap. This meat was tough and stringy, requiring enormous amounts of chewing just to break it down enough to swallow. Their jaws would work constantly, grinding and tearing, and sometimes, that meat would be mixed with sand and grit, depending on how they had to prepare their kill directly on the ground where they found themselves. Can you imagine that texture? That unpleasant feeling of tiny particles of sand grinding between your teeth, scraping against the enamel with every bite. Then there were the roots and tubers they would dig up from the earth with primitive tools, or even their bare hands. These underground vegetables were often as hard as wood, packed with tough fibers that resisted breaking down. And inevitably, no matter how carefully they tried to clean them, these roots would still carry traces of soil, little bits of dirt and stone that would crunch unpleasantly between their teeth. Seeds and nuts formed another crucial part of their diet, valuable sources of fat and protein that could mean the difference between survival and starvation. But to get to the nutritious meat inside, their teeth had to crack through incredibly hard shells. Imagine the pressure, the stress on each individual tooth as it struggled to break through the tough exterior of a walnut or acorn. The risk of chipping a tooth, or even breaking one entirely, was a constant threat with every meal. And then, as human society slowly began to develop and agriculture started to take root, people began eating more grains: wheat, barley, primitive forms of corn. While these grains provided valuable carbohydrates and energy, they also brought new problems. These early grains were processed very roughly, often ground between stones that would leave tiny fragments of grit mixed in with the flour. And when those grain-based foods sat in the mouth, they fermented easily, creating acids that slowly but steadily ate away at tooth enamel. The grinding process itself was imperfect, leaving chunks and pieces that would wedge themselves firmly between teeth, staying there for days or even weeks if there was no effective way to remove them. These trapped particles would begin to rot and decay, creating perfect breeding grounds for the bacteria that cause tooth decay and gum disease. Sugar, as we know it today, those refined crystalline sweeteners, didn't exist in their world, but nature provided its own versions. Wild honey, when they were lucky enough to find it, and tree fruits that ripened to incredible sweetness during their brief seasons. While these natural sugars were rare treats, they could be just as damaging to teeth if they weren't cleaned away. And of course, there was no cleaning them away. So imagine, if you will, finishing one of these typical meals. Your teeth have just spent an hour grinding through tough, stringy meat mixed with sand. You've cracked open hard nuts, chewed through fibrous roots, still gritty with soil, and perhaps even enjoyed some sweet, sticky honey as a rare treat. Every surface of every tooth is now coated with a mixture of food particles, natural sugars, and abrasive grit. This debris sits there, hour after hour, day after day, slowly hardening into a cement-like coating. Bacteria begin to multiply in this rich environment, producing acids that eat away at tooth enamel, creating the perfect conditions for decay and infection. And there's nothing, absolutely nothing, available to remove it. But how do we know all this? How can we be so certain about the dental struggles of people who lived so long ago that they left no written records, no detailed accounts of their daily sufferings? The answer lies in the bones. Archaeological researchers, when they carefully excavate and study the skeletal remains of our ancient ancestors, have discovered overwhelming evidence of just how terrible dental health was in those times. They found teeth that are worn down so severely they barely resemble teeth at all, ground down almost to the very roots, the white enamel completely gone, exposing the dark, sensitive inner layers. Can you imagine the constant, throbbing agony of having teeth worn down to that extent? Just drawing in a breath of cold air would send shooting pains through your skull. The simple act of drinking cool water would be torture. These worn surfaces tell a story of decades spent grinding tough food mixed with sand and grit. The constant abrasion slowly but inevitably wearing away what should have been the hardest substance in the human body. What's particularly heartbreaking is that many of these severely worn teeth belong to skeletons of people who were still relatively young, evidence that this wasn't just the result of extreme old age, but of a lifetime of harsh eating conditions. Cavities, deep, dark holes in the teeth where decay has eaten completely through the enamel and into the soft tissue beneath, are found in abundance. These aren't the small, easily treatable cavities that modern dentistry can fix with a simple filling. These are massive craters, sometimes consuming entire teeth, creating hollow shells that must have throbbed with constant pain. Without any understanding of bacteria or oral hygiene, without any tools for cleaning or any knowledge of how to prevent decay, these cavities would have grown larger and deeper over months and years, eventually reaching the nerve and creating levels of pain that are difficult for us to imagine. Evidence of gum disease is equally common in these ancient remains. Researchers can see where gums receded dramatically, exposing tooth roots and making teeth loose and unstable. They find clear signs of inflammation and infection, places where the bone that held teeth in place was actually eaten away by disease. Tooth loss at relatively young ages was tragically common. Skeletons of people in their 20s and 30s often show multiple missing teeth, not from violence or accidents, but from the simple progression of decay and disease. Imagine trying to hunt, to survive, to chew the tough foods that were your only option for nutrition, when you were missing several of your essential grinding teeth. Perhaps most disturbing of all are the signs of severe infections, abscesses that formed when bacteria from decayed teeth spread into the surrounding bone and tissue. These infections would have caused facial swelling that made eating and drinking difficult, fevers that weakened the entire body, and pain that never, ever stopped. Some of these infections were so severe that researchers can see where they ate away portions of the jawbone itself. And in some tragic cases, these dental infections appear to have been the actual cause of death. A simple cavity that grew into an infection that ultimately overwhelmed the person's ability to fight it off. But perhaps the most poignant evidence comes from the scratches and scrape marks that archaeologists have found on many ancient teeth. These tiny grooves and gouges, created by some kind of sharp tool, show that people back then were desperately trying to help themselves, to find some relief from their constant dental misery. They would use pointed sticks, sharp stones, even animal bones to try to scrape away trapped food, to try to drain infected areas, or simply to try to find some way, any way, to reduce their pain. These marks tell stories of desperate, painful attempts at self-care, people using whatever primitive tools they could find to try to solve problems they couldn't possibly understand. Now, place yourself in the position of someone living during those times. You've just finished a meal consisting entirely of tough, stringy meat, hard seeds, and fibrous roots. The feeling of food debris still lodged throughout your mouth must have been incredibly uncomfortable, don't you think? It wasn't just the physical sensation of having chunks of food stuck between your teeth, creating pressure and irritation with every movement of your jaw. There was also the taste, the gradually souring flavor as trapped food began to decompose in the warm, moist environment of your mouth. And then there was the smell. Bad breath wasn't just socially awkward in those times. It was a barrier to basic human interaction. Even in the most primitive societies, people lived in small, close-knit groups where communication and cooperation were essential for survival. The ability to speak closely with others, to share food, to show affection, all of these would have been affected by the overwhelming smell of rotting food and infected teeth. But the real motivation for trying to clean their teeth came from the pain. What might start as mild irritation from trapped food could quickly develop into something much more serious. A small piece of meat wedged between two teeth could cause the gums to become inflamed and tender. That inflammation could become infection. That infection could spread. A constant, dull toothache, the kind that never goes away, that makes it impossible to concentrate on anything else could completely ruin a day of hunting that your family was depending on for survival. It could make eating so painful that you couldn't get adequate nutrition. It could keep you awake at night when you desperately needed rest. The pain of infected teeth is particularly relentless, unlike other types of pain that might come and go, or that you can find positions to relieve. Tooth pain is trapped inside your skull, pulsing with every heartbeat, impossible to escape. Modern people who have experienced severe tooth pain often describe it as one of the worst pains they've ever felt, even with access to powerful painkillers. Imagine enduring that same pain with no relief whatsoever. It was from these persistent discomforts, from the irritation of trapped food, the embarrassment of bad breath, and especially from the desperate need to somehow find relief from constant dental pain, that humans first began to experiment, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes with more deliberate intent. The need to clean teeth and mouth, though it wouldn't be given a proper name for thousands of years to come, was slowly beginning to take shape in the human mind. They might rinse their mouths with water from a stream, swishing it around and spitting it out, hoping to wash away some of the debris. They might use their tongues more deliberately, pressing and rubbing against teeth to try to dislodge stuck food. But water alone couldn't reach everything, and tongues and fingers had their obvious limitations. Something more was needed, something that could reach into those narrow spaces between teeth, something that could scrape and rub more effectively than soft human tissue. So when fingers proved inadequate, when plain water couldn't solve the problem, what did they turn to next? What improvised tools emerged from that desperate, urgent need to find relief? The natural world around them was full of possibilities. Countless trees with branches of different sizes and textures, plants with various types of leaves, stones shaped by rivers and weather, even animal bones that could be modified and shaped. Did this abundant, natural environment provide them with some emergency solutions for their dental distress? In our next chapter, we'll pull back the curtain of mystery together, looking directly at the actual tools that our ancestors created and used to cope with their aching teeth. We'll discover the ingenious and sometimes shocking ways they adapted materials from their environment to serve as the world's first dental equipment. And as I mentioned earlier, some of these methods, some of these solutions, might make you shudder just a little bit. These were not the gentle, carefully designed instruments we use today. They were rough, improvised, often painful tools born from desperation and necessity. But they represent something beautiful too. The endless human drive to solve problems, to reduce suffering, to find ways to make life just a little bit more bearable, even in the harshest possible circumstances. Every scratch mark on those ancient teeth tells a story of someone who refused to simply accept pain as inevitable, who tried to take control of their own discomfort in whatever way they could. Just relax now. Let your breathing become even slower and deeper, and allow your imagination to carry you further back in time. We're about to step into a world of prehistoric dental solutions, a world of creativity born from necessity, where everything had to be invented from scratch using only what nature provided. A world before anyone had ever dreamed of the soft, gentle bristles we take for granted today. Picture this scene, if you will. After a meal of tough wild game and hard roots that left an uncomfortable mixture of meat fibers and gritty particles lodged throughout your mouth, you look around at the world surrounding you. Your ancestors, with that remarkable human ingenuity that has always driven us to solve problems, began to notice the abundance of possibilities right at their fingertips. And the most available, most obvious solution was probably small branches from trees. Now, this wasn't just any random stick they might grab. Through countless generations of trial and error, and probably some very unpleasant mistakes along the way, they gradually learned which types of trees produce branches that were soft enough not to damage tender gums, yet firm enough to actually accomplish some cleaning. They would carefully select a twig, perhaps about the thickness of your pinky finger, or sometimes even smaller. One end of this branch would then be chewed, and chewed, and chewed, until the wood fibers began to separate and fray, creating something that looked remarkably like a tiny, primitive brush. Can you imagine the texture? The way those wooden fibers would feel against your tongue as you worked them into the right shape? The slightly bitter, earthy taste of raw wood filling your mouth. It certainly wasn't minty fresh, but it was functional. Once they had created this makeshift brush, they would use it to scrub against the surfaces of their teeth, trying to dislodge stuck food particles and scrape away the sticky film that accumulated day after day. The sensation must have been quite rough, nothing like the soft nylon bristles we're accustomed to. Picture those frayed wood fibers, somewhat stiff and scratchy, rubbing against tooth enamel and gums. It would have felt, well, rather like scrubbing with a tiny wooden brush, which is essentially what it was. Some types of trees turned out to be particularly well suited for this purpose. The miswak tree, also known as arak, which grows in the Middle East and Africa, became especially prized. When chewed, its branches release natural compounds that have mild antibacterial properties and a slightly spicy, pleasant taste, at least by the standards of people who had very few pleasant flavors in their daily lives. Even today, thousands of years later, miswak twigs are still used in some parts of the world, valued for their natural cleaning properties and the fact that they require no additional toothpaste or processing. When you chew the end of a miswak twig, it naturally separates into soft fibers while releasing beneficial plant chemicals that help clean and protect teeth. In India, people discovered the benefits of neem tree branches. Neem has powerful antibacterial properties that modern science has confirmed, and chewing these twigs not only cleaned teeth, but was believed to promote healthier gums. The taste was intensely bitter, probably quite unpleasant by our standards, but the cleaning effect was noticeable. Using a chew stick wasn't just a quick morning routine like brushing our teeth today. It was often a leisurely, ongoing activity. People might walk around with a twig in their mouth, chewing and cleaning throughout the day. It served multiple purposes, keeping the mouth busy, gradually cleaning the teeth, and providing something to do with your hands and mouth during quiet moments. You can imagine groups of people sitting around a fire in the evening, each methodically working on their own chew stick. The soft sounds of wood fibers being separated mixing with the crackling of flames and the distant sounds of nighttime creatures. But of course, chew sticks had their limitations. While they could clean the surfaces of teeth reasonably well, They struggled to reach into the narrow spaces between teeth where food particles love to hide. And if someone chose the wrong type of wood, too hard, too rough, or from a tree with irritating properties, they could easily damage their gums or wear away precious tooth enamel. Some people undoubtedly chewed too aggressively or used twigs that were too stiff, resulting in scraped gums, bleeding, and sometimes even scratches on the teeth themselves. Archaeological evidence shows wear patterns on ancient teeth that suggest both helpful cleaning and, unfortunately, some damage from overly enthusiastic or poorly executed attempts at oral hygiene. The effectiveness of chew sticks also depended entirely on having access to the right kinds of trees. People living in areas with limited vegetation or during seasons when suitable branches weren't available would have had to find alternative solutions, some of which were considerably less pleasant. Beyond the larger chew sticks used for general cleaning, our ancestors also discovered the usefulness of much smaller, more precise tools for tackling specific problems, particularly those stubborn food particles that wedge themselves firmly between teeth. Picture the frustration of having a tough piece of meat fiber stuck between your molars, creating constant irritation and pressure with every bite. Modern dental floss would solve this problem in seconds, but our ancestors had to be far more creative and considerably more brave. They would carefully select the thinnest possible twigs, sometimes no thicker than a modern toothpick, or even thin thorns from certain plants, though these had to be chosen and prepared very carefully to avoid injury. Can you imagine the patience required to find just the right thorn, one that was long enough and thin enough to slip between teeth, but not so sharp that it would pierce the tender gum tissue? The process required extraordinary care and skill. Using a primitive wooden pick or a carefully prepared thorn, they would gently work at dislodging trapped food particles, slowly and patiently coaxing them free. One moment of carelessness could result in a punctured gum, a scratch on the tooth surface, or even worse, pushing the offending food particle deeper into the gum line where it could cause infection. Archaeological evidence for this practice comes in the form of tiny grooves and scratches found on ancient teeth, marks that could only have been made by someone carefully working with a thin, pointed implement. These microscopic scratches tell stories of people who were willing to risk minor injury in exchange for relief from the constant discomfort of trapped food. The toothpicks they created were nothing like our modern, mass-produced wooden picks. These were rough, handmade tools crafted from whatever materials were available. A small twig might be carefully sharpened by scraping it against a rock. A thorn might be broken to just the right length and carefully smoothed. Some people use thin splinters of animal bone, painstakingly shaped and pointed. Others discovered that certain types of grass, when dried and stiffened, could serve as effective picks. The variety of materials used shows just how universal and urgent this need was. People were willing to experiment with almost anything that might provide relief. But this wasn't a gentle, risk-free process. These improvised toothpicks were often rough and potentially dangerous. Unlike our smooth, professionally manufactured dental tools, these primitive implements could easily cause cuts, scrapes, and punctures. The risk of infection from a small wound in the mouth was very real, especially given the generally poor understanding of cleanliness and hygiene at the time. Some people undoubtedly pushed too hard, trying to remove particularly stubborn debris, and ended up driving food particles deeper into their gums or creating painful wounds that became infected. Others may have used materials that were too rough or had irritating properties, leading to swelling and inflammation. Yet, despite these risks, people continued to use these primitive tools because the alternative, living with constantly trapped food, persistent bad breath, and the gradual development of painful infections, was simply unbearable. The archaeological evidence shows that this wasn't just an occasional practice, but a regular part of daily life for many people. The tiny scratches and grooves on ancient teeth often show patterns that suggest repeated use over long periods of time. These weren't one-time experiments, but ongoing attempts to maintain some level of oral comfort, using whatever tools could be improvised from the natural world. Now, we come to perhaps the most unsettling of the ancient dental hygiene methods. Are you ready for this? The use of stones, sand, and charcoal as tooth cleaning agents. It sounds almost unbelievable by today's standards, doesn't it? Using sand, actual sand, to scrub your teeth? But remember, we're talking about a time when the concept of gentle oral care simply didn't exist. People were dealing with stubborn accumulations of food debris, persistent stains, and the constant discomfort of teeth that never felt truly clean. Sometimes, desperate situations called for rather extreme measures. There's indirect archaeological evidence suggesting that some ancient peoples experimented with finely ground stone powder, sand, or crushed charcoal as abrasive cleaning agents. They would take a small amount of these materials, hopefully choosing the finest, least harsh versions they could find, and rub them directly onto their teeth, attempting to scrub away stubborn stains and accumulated debris. Try to imagine, for just a moment, the sensation of having sand moving around inside your mouth, grinding against your tooth enamel, the gritty, uncomfortable texture, the way those tiny particles would work their way into every crevice and space, the harsh scraping feeling as you rub this abrasive mixture against your teeth. It would have provided an immediate sense of cleanliness, that feeling of having everything scraped away, leaving teeth feeling smooth and polished. But the long-term consequences of this practice were devastating. Each use would literally grind away a thin layer of precious tooth enamel, the hard, protective coating that once lost can never be replaced. The appeal of these abrasive methods is understandable when you consider the alternatives. People dealing with thick accumulations of debris, persistent stains, or the embarrassment of visibly dirty teeth might have felt that the immediate benefits were worth the unknown long-term costs. After all, they had no understanding of tooth enamel as a finite, irreplaceable resource. Sand and ground stone would indeed remove stains and debris very effectively, along with healthy tooth structure. Over time, teeth cleaned this way would become increasingly sensitive as the protective enamel wore away. They would also become more susceptible to decay and damage, ultimately making the original problems much worse. Charcoal represented a slightly different approach to the same problem. Unlike sand and stone, which worked purely through abrasion, charcoal has natural, absorptive properties that may have actually provided some genuine benefits. Ancient people may have discovered that rubbing charcoal on their teeth helped remove odors and some types of stains. Interestingly, activated charcoal has made something of a comeback in modern dental products, though the charcoal used today is specially processed and much gentler than the rough, unrefined charcoal that ancient people would have had access to. Their version would have been essentially burnt wood, coarse, gritty, and far too abrasive for safe use. These abrasive cleaning methods represent the ultimate double-edged sword in ancient dental care. Yes, they could provide immediate relief and a sense of cleanliness that was probably quite satisfying after days or weeks of accumulated discomfort. The feeling of having truly clean teeth, even temporarily, must have been wonderful. But the price paid for this temporary relief was the gradual destruction of the teeth themselves. People using these methods were essentially trading long-term dental health for short-term comfort, though, of course, they had no way of understanding this trade-off at the time. The evidence for these practices comes not just from the materials found at archaeological sites, but also from the patterns of wear visible on ancient teeth. Some skeletons show tooth wear patterns that are consistent with the use of abrasive materials, surfaces that are polished smooth in ways that natural food consumption alone couldn't explain. More troubling are the teeth that show extreme wear combined with evidence of sensitivity and damage. These tell stories of people who may have initially found relief through abrasive cleaning methods, only to discover that their teeth became increasingly painful and problematic over time. This represents one of those fascinating historical examples where good intentions and desperate need led to solutions that actually made problems worse. It's a reminder of how much we take for granted our modern understanding of dental health, the knowledge that tooth enamel is precious and irreplaceable, that gentle cleaning is more effective than aggressive scrubbing, and that some short-term solutions can create much bigger long-term problems. When you use your soft-bristled toothbrush tonight, with its carefully designed bristles and gentle cleaning action, you might pause for a moment to appreciate the thousands of years of trial and error, and unfortunately, some very painful mistakes that led to the development of truly effective oral care. Fortunately, not all ancient cleaning methods involved such harsh materials. Our ancestors weren't always reaching for the most aggressive solutions available. Sometimes they experimented with approaches that were considerably more gentle and more similar to what we might recognize as reasonable oral hygiene today. Some types of leaves, particularly those with slightly textured surfaces or natural oils, could be used as primitive cleaning cloths. People would select leaves carefully, avoiding anything that might be poisonous or irritating, and then crush or manipulate them to release their natural moisture and oils. They might wrap a prepared leaf around their finger, creating a sort of primitive washcloth, and then use this to rub against their teeth and gums. The texture of the leaf would provide gentle abrasion to remove debris, while any natural oils or beneficial plant compounds could help freshen breath or soothe irritated gums. Different regions would have offered different possibilities. In areas with abundant vegetation, people might have had access to mint family plants that provided naturally fresh flavors and antibacterial properties. Other regions might have offered leaves with natural astringent qualities that could help tighten and heal gum tissue. The selection process would have required considerable knowledge and experience. People would need to know which plants were safe to put in their mouths, which ones provided beneficial effects, and which ones to avoid entirely. This knowledge was probably passed down through generations, with each family or group developing their own preferred methods and materials. As textile production developed and became more sophisticated, even primitive cloth became available for oral hygiene purposes. This represented a significant advancement in both comfort and effectiveness. A piece of rough cloth, dampened with water, could be wrapped around a finger and used to clean teeth much more gently than twigs or abrasives. These early dental cloths were nothing like our modern soft tissues or dental wipes. They were probably rough, scratchy fabrics made from plant fibers or even thin animal hides. But compared to sand or thorns, they must have felt wonderfully gentle and civilized. Of course, reusing cloth for oral hygiene presented its own challenges. Without understanding of bacteria and proper sterilization, these cloths could easily become breeding grounds for harmful microorganisms. They might be rinsed in whatever water was available, but true cleaning and sanitization was impossible. Some cloths might be used until they literally fell apart, accumulating bacteria and debris that could actually make oral health problems worse rather than better. Others might be shared among family members, potentially spreading infections and diseases. Despite these limitations, the use of leaves and cloth represented an important conceptual advancement. These methods showed an understanding that oral hygiene didn't necessarily require harsh, painful techniques. They demonstrated a growing appreciation for the benefits of gentle, regular cleaning over aggressive, damaging approaches. These softer methods also suggested a developing sense of what we might call comfort in oral care. The idea that taking care of your teeth didn't have to be an ordeal, but could be a relatively pleasant, soothing experience. Water alone, while helpful, often wasn't enough to provide the level of cleaning and freshening that people craved. So our resourceful ancestors began experimenting with various natural additives that might enhance the cleaning power of their oral hygiene routines. Salt water was probably one of the earliest and most effective natural mouthwash solutions. In coastal areas or regions with natural salt deposits, people may have discovered quite early that rinsing with salt water provided benefits that plain water couldn't match. Salt has natural antibacterial properties and can help reduce inflammation in gum tissue. The sensation of salt water in the mouth, that distinctive, slightly harsh taste, and the way it seems to cut through oils and debris, probably provided immediate feedback that something beneficial was happening. People living near the ocean had easy access to salt water, though they would have had to be careful about the concentration. Seawater can be quite harsh if used too frequently. Those living inland might have discovered natural salt springs or learned to create their own salt solutions by evaporating water from salt-rich sources. The natural world provided numerous other possibilities for oral rinses. Various herbs, when steeped in water, could create solutions with different beneficial properties. Some plants provided natural astringents that could help tighten gum tissue and reduce bleeding. Others offered antibacterial compounds that could help fight the bacteria responsible for tooth decay and bad breath. Ancient people might have chewed certain aromatic leaves and then held the resulting juices in their mouths, essentially creating their own herbal mouthwashes. Or they might have learned to create teas from specific plants, allowing the liquid to cool before using it as a mouth rinse. Of course, this experimentation wasn't without risks. People had to learn through experience which plants were safe to use in the mouth and which ones might cause irritation, allergic reactions, or even poisoning. Some plants that seemed promising might have turned out to cause mouth sores or other problems. The knowledge of which plants provided benefits and which ones to avoid would have been accumulated slowly over many generations, with each culture developing its own preferred recipes and methods. This information would have been shared within families and communities, creating the earliest forms of folk medicine for oral health. These natural mouthwash solutions, while often genuinely beneficial, still operated within the limitations of ancient understanding. People had no knowledge of bacteria or the specific mechanisms that cause tooth decay and gum disease. Their solutions were based on immediate sensory feedback. What tasted good? What made their mouths feel cleaner? What seemed to provide relief from pain or discomfort? Some of these traditional remedies have actually been validated by modern science and are still used today. Others, while not harmful, may not have provided the benefits that ancient people believed they did, and some may have actually caused problems that weren't immediately apparent. As we move toward exploring other aspects of ancient daily life, it's worth reflecting on these early attempts at oral hygiene. They show us humans at their most inventive and determined, willing to experiment, to take risks, to try almost anything in pursuit of comfort and health. The next challenge we'll explore together is perhaps even more personal and definitely less pleasant to contemplate. What people did before toilet paper existed. Now then, after exploring the somewhat prickly world of prehistoric dental care, let's shift our attention to another aspect of daily life from the past. An aspect that is, well, perhaps even more delicate than what we've discussed so far. We're talking about answering nature's call, a biological necessity that no living creature can avoid, including us humans, regardless of which era we happen to find ourselves living in. Today, we have wonderfully convenient private bathrooms, and most importantly, those soft, clean rolls of toilet paper that we barely think about. Something so completely ordinary that we hardly give it a second thought. But have you ever wondered, in a quiet moment of curiosity, how people managed before these conveniences existed? Please prepare yourself for a journey into the history of, well, personal hygiene after using the bathroom. And once again, I must warn you, some of this information might make you wrinkle your nose a bit. But this is an important part of the story of human adaptability and creativity. What we're about to explore together is perhaps one of the most universal human experiences, yet also one of the least discussed in polite conversation. Throughout all of history, in every culture, people have had to solve this very basic, very practical problem: what to do after finishing their business. The solutions they came up with were sometimes ingenious, sometimes desperate, and often, well, let's just say they make us appreciate our modern conveniences in ways we never imagined possible. From leaves and moss to sticks and stones, from corn cobs to strips of cloth, the variety of materials people have used throughout history is both fascinating and occasionally horrifying. But don't worry, We'll explore these topics with the same gentle, sleepy pace we've maintained throughout our journey. Think of this as just another chapter in the endless human story of problem solving and adaptation. After all, these were real people dealing with real, everyday challenges, using whatever resources they had available. So settle in a little deeper into your comfortable spot. Let your breathing slow down naturally and prepare to appreciate some modern conveniences you might never have thought to appreciate before. For prehistoric peoples, and indeed for many civilizations that followed, the concept of a bathroom, as we know it, simply didn't exist. There was no private room with a porcelain fixture and a convenient handle to pull. Instead, the entire natural world served as their restroom, and they had to work within whatever privacy, or lack thereof, their environment provided. They might seek out a secluded area behind some bushes, a cluster of trees, a rocky outcropping, or sometimes, when privacy wasn't available or wasn't considered important, simply an open patch of ground at a reasonable distance from their living area. The notion of having a dedicated permanent toilet was a luxury that wouldn't emerge for thousands of years. And once they had finished their business, the immediate question became, what to use for cleaning up? The answer, for the vast majority of human history, was simple: whatever nature provided nearby. And the variety of natural toilet paper available in different environments was quite remarkable, though not always pleasant. Leaves were probably the most widespread and practical solution. Large, broad leaves that were soft enough not to cause irritation, yet substantial enough to be effective. But this wasn't just a matter of grabbing any leaf within reach. Through generations of sometimes painful trial and error, people learned to identify which leaves were safe to use and which ones to avoid at all costs. Can you imagine the learning process? Someone, somewhere, had to be the first to discover that certain leaves caused terrible itching, burning, or rashes. Others turned out to be perfectly safe and even pleasantly soft. This knowledge became precious information, passed down from parents to children. Which plants were your friends in moments of need, and which ones were definitely your enemies? They would look for leaves that were broad enough to be useful, soft enough to be comfortable, and most importantly, non-toxic and non-irritating. Certain types of large tree leaves, particular varieties of broad grasses, or specific plants known for their soft texture became the preferred choices in different regions. Grass was another common option, especially in areas where suitable leaves weren't readily available. People would gather handfuls of the softest grass they could find, crushing it together to create a more effective cleaning tool. However, grass presented its own challenges. It wasn't particularly absorbent, and some varieties could be quite sharp or scratchy against sensitive skin. The technique probably involved gathering quite a lot of grass and bundling it together to create something more substantial and useful. You can imagine people developing their own preferred methods. Some might weave the grass together. Others might simply crush it into a rough ball or pad. Moss represented something of a luxury in the prehistoric personal hygiene world. In areas where it was available, typically damper, more humid environments, moss offered several advantages over leaves or grass. It was naturally soft and spongy, had excellent absorbent qualities, and felt much more comfortable against the skin than rougher alternatives. Picture the difference. Instead of rough, potentially scratchy leaves, or sharp grass, you could use something that was naturally cushioned and absorbent. Moss was probably the closest thing to comfortable that prehistoric bathroom experiences could offer. Finding a good patch of clean, soft moss must have felt like discovering a small treasure. But even with these natural options, there was considerable skill involved in making good choices. People had to learn to identify not just what was safe to use, but what would actually be effective. A leaf that looked perfect might turn out to be too thin or fragile. Grass that seemed soft might be deceptively sharp. Moss that appeared clean might be hiding insects or other unpleasant surprises. The process of selection probably became quite sophisticated over time. People learned to test materials with their hands first, to look for signs of contamination or irritation, to understand the properties of different plants in different seasons. What worked well in spring might not be available in winter. What was perfect in one location might be terrible in another. Different environments presented completely different challenges and opportunities. People living in lush forested areas had abundant choices, but had to learn to distinguish between safe and dangerous plants. Those in grassland regions might have fewer options, but more predictable, familiar materials. People in arid environments faced the greatest challenges, often having to make do with whatever scarce vegetation they could find. And then there were seasonal variations to consider. Spring might bring tender new leaves and fresh growth. Summer offered the greatest variety and abundance. Fall meant dried, brittle materials that weren't always pleasant to use. Winter, well, winter was probably when people really had to get creative and resourceful. In locations blessed with access to rivers, streams, lakes, or other water sources, people discovered what was probably the most effective and comfortable cleaning method available in the ancient world: using water directly for cleansing. After completing their business, people who lived near water sources could simply use their hands and clean water to wash themselves thoroughly. This was undoubtedly one of the most hygienic approaches possible given the technology and understanding of the time, assuming, of course, that the water source was reasonably clean and unpolluted. The process was fairly straightforward, but required some preparation. They might use a cupped hand, a large leaf formed into a makeshift bowl, or a hollowed-out gourd or shell to scoop and pour water. The cleaning process would be methodical and thorough, using the natural flowing action of water combined with gentle scrubbing to achieve cleanliness that was far superior to what dry materials could provide. This practice actually established the foundation for cultural traditions that persist to this day. In many parts of the world, using water for personal cleansing after using the bathroom is still considered the most hygienic and appropriate method. The left hand became designated for cleaning purposes, while the right hand was reserved for eating, greeting others, and other social activities, a practical division that made perfect sense when you consider the sanitation challenges of the time. For people who had regular access to clean water, bathroom activities could become almost pleasant, might be too strong a word, but certainly more comfortable and civilized than the alternatives. They could take their time, ensure thorough cleansing, and emerge feeling genuinely clean rather than just minimally functional. However, This water-based approach came with its own set of challenges and considerations. Privacy was often limited when you had to go down to the riverbank or lakeside for your cleaning routine. You were potentially vulnerable to wild animals, especially during dawn or dusk, when many predators were most active. And of course, you were quite exposed to other people who might also be using the water source for their own needs. Water wasn't always readily available when and where it was needed. During dry seasons, water sources might be too far away to be practical for regular use. In winter, water could be painfully cold or even frozen solid. During floods or storms, water sources might be too dangerous to approach. Some people living near water had to be careful about the timing of their cleaning activities. Using a water source that the entire community depended on for drinking, cooking, and other needs required some consideration for public health and social harmony. There were probably informal agreements about when and where such personal activities could take place. People became quite creative in developing ways to transport and use water for cleaning purposes. They might use large shells as portable basins, hollow out gourds to create primitive pitchers, or even use animal bladders as flexible water containers. Some communities near water sources may have designated specific areas and developed simple tools to make the cleaning process more convenient and effective. The availability of water for personal cleansing probably influenced social structures and cultural practices in ways we can only guess at today. Communities with good access to water sources may have developed different standards of cleanliness and personal hygiene than those who had to rely entirely on dry materials. These differences could affect everything from social interactions to courtship rituals to religious or spiritual practices. The concept of cleanliness itself was probably quite different in water-rich versus water-poor communities. What one group considered perfectly acceptable hygiene might seem inadequate or inappropriate to another group with different resources and practices. Now we come to what might be the most challenging aspect of ancient personal hygiene practices. In some locations, particularly arid regions where plant materials were scarce, people had to resort to what we might charitably call firmer solutions to their cleaning needs. I know this sounds almost unbelievable to our modern sensibilities, but archaeological evidence and historical records confirm that people did indeed use items like smooth sticks, polished stones, and even specially prepared pieces of bone for personal cleaning purposes. Prepared sticks were probably the most common of these firm solutions. People would carefully select pieces of wood, usually from softer varieties of trees, and spend considerable time smoothing and shaping one end to create what was essentially a primitive scraping tool. The wood had to be soft enough not to cause injury, but firm enough to be effective for cleaning. The preparation process was crucial and probably quite time-consuming. A stick that was too rough could cause painful scratches or cuts. One that wasn't shaped properly might be ineffective or even dangerous to use. People probably developed considerable expertise in selecting the right type of wood and preparing it properly. Historical records tell us that the ancient Romans actually developed a somewhat more sophisticated version of this concept. They created something called a xylospongium, or tersorium, essentially a natural sponge attached to the end of a stick. But here's where it gets particularly unpleasant to our modern thinking. These tools were often used communally in public restrooms. Multiple people would share the same cleaning implement, and between uses, it would be rinsed in a bucket of salt water or vinegar. The idea was that the salt water or vinegar would provide some level of, let's call it, sanitization, though by today's standards, we can imagine how effective that really was. Can you picture the scene? Public latrines where people would sit side by side, and when they finished, they would reach for this shared cleaning tool that had just been used by the person before them. The social dynamics alone must have been quite interesting. Smooth stones represented another option in areas where wood was scarce but suitable rocks were available. People would seek out stones that had been naturally polished by water action, river rocks, beach stones, or stones from dried lake beds that had been worn smooth over time. The selection process was critical. The stone had to be large enough to be useful, but small enough to handle safely. It needed to be smooth enough not to cause cuts or scratches, but it also had to have enough texture to be effective for cleaning. Too smooth, and it wouldn't work well. Too rough, and it could cause serious injury. I realize this is quite difficult to imagine. The sensation of using a stone for such an intimate cleaning purpose. It certainly wasn't comfortable by any standard we would recognize today. But for people living in desert regions or other areas where softer materials simply weren't available, this represented the best solution they could devise. After use, these stones might be washed and reused, or simply discarded depending on local customs and the availability of suitable replacements. Some families or communities might have maintained collections of properly prepared stones, treating them as valuable household tools. It's important to understand that these weren't choices made out of ignorance or indifference to comfort. These were practical solutions developed by people who needed to solve a universal human problem using only the materials their environment provided. The fact that they were willing to use such uncomfortable methods speaks to how essential this aspect of hygiene was to them. The archaeological evidence for these practices comes partly from the tools themselves, carefully shaped sticks and selected stones found at ancient sites, and partly from written records left by civilizations that had developed writing systems. These records often describe the practices of neighboring peoples or earlier generations, giving us glimpses into sanitation methods that might otherwise be lost to history. Fortunately, for the development of human comfort, people in some parts of the world eventually discovered materials that were considerably more pleasant to use than sticks and stones. When European explorers first arrived in the Americas, they encountered many things that surprised and puzzled them. Among the more mundane, yet personally relevant discoveries was the ingenious way that Native American peoples had solved the age-old problem of personal hygiene. They used corn cobs, the central core that remains after all the kernels have been removed and eaten. This might sound unusual to us today, but it was actually quite a clever solution when you consider the properties of corn cobs and the abundance of corn in many Native American communities. Corn cobs, when properly dried and prepared, offered several advantages over many other natural materials. They were absorbent enough to be effective, soft enough to be reasonably comfortable, especially compared to stones or rough sticks, and substantial enough to be easy to handle. The naturally rough, but not overly harsh texture provided good cleaning action without being painful. The preparation probably involved letting the cobs dry thoroughly after the corn was harvested, ensuring they were clean and free from any remaining kernel fragments or debris. Some communities might have developed specific techniques for treating or preparing the cobs to make them more suitable for their intended purpose. In agricultural communities where corn was a staple crop, this solution had the tremendous advantage of being readily available in large quantities. Every ear of corn consumed provided a ready-made cleaning tool, creating a sustainable supply that didn't require any special gathering, hunting, or manufacturing. This abundance also meant that people could afford to be somewhat selective, choosing cobs that were the right size and texture for comfortable use, and discarding any that were too rough, too small, or otherwise unsuitable. European colonists, initially skeptical or shocked by many Native American practices, actually adopted this particular innovation quite readily once they understood its practical advantages. Corn cobs remained a common toilet paper substitute in rural American areas well into the 19th and even early 20th centuries. The transition from corn cobs to manufactured toilet paper was gradual, with many households using whatever was most readily available or economical. Farm families might use corn cobs during harvest season when they were plentiful, then switch to other materials when the supply ran low. The corn cob solution represents a perfect example of human adaptability and resourcefulness. People looked at their environment, identified an abundant waste product from their food production, and found a way to transform it into a useful tool for addressing a universal human need. It's the kind of practical innovation that characterizes human problem solving throughout history. As textile production developed and became more sophisticated, people gained access to a new category of cleaning materials: cloth. When clothing wore out beyond repair, or when fabric was damaged during production, the scraps and remnants could find new life, serving a very different but essential purpose. Fabric scraps offered significant advantages over most natural materials. Depending on the type of cloth, they could be much softer than leaves or grass, more absorbent than many plant materials, and considerably more comfortable than any of the firm solutions we discussed earlier. Wealthier individuals or communities with access to finer textiles might use soft wool, linen, or even silk remnants. These materials provided a level of comfort that was probably quite luxurious by the standards of the time. Soft wool, in particular, was naturally absorbent and gentle against the skin. However, this advancement in comfort brought with it a question that might make us rather uncomfortable today: what to do with these fabric pieces after use? Some were probably treated as disposable, especially if fabric was reasonably abundant. But in many cases, especially for poorer families or communities where textile materials were precious, these cloths were washed and reused. The washing process would have involved whatever cleaning methods were available at the time, usually cold water, perhaps with some type of natural soap if it was available, or maybe just thorough rinsing and scrubbing. By modern standards of hygiene and sanitation, this reuse practice seems quite problematic, but at the time, it represented the best compromise between comfort and economy that people could achieve. The use of fabric for personal hygiene represented an important conceptual step toward our modern approach. It demonstrated an understanding that softer, more absorbent materials provided better cleaning and greater comfort. This recognition would eventually lead to the development of materials specifically designed for this purpose, rather than just repurposing waste or discarded items. Despite all these various attempts at personal cleansing, it's important to understand that the concept of hygiene, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist for most of human history. People had no knowledge of bacteria, viruses, or the mechanisms by which diseases spread from person to person. The lack of understanding about invisible microorganisms meant that even people who made genuine efforts to clean themselves were still at serious risk for a wide variety of health problems. Intestinal parasites, digestive tract infections, skin conditions, and other hygiene-related illnesses were incredibly common throughout most of human history. Improper waste disposal and inadequate personal cleaning also had serious consequences for entire communities. Contaminated water sources, polluted living areas, and the spread of diseases through poor sanitation practices created conditions where epidemics could spread rapidly and devastatingly through populations. Many of the great plagues and disease outbreaks of history were directly related to poor understanding of sanitation and hygiene. Cities and towns that grew without proper waste management systems became breeding grounds for cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and countless other diseases that we now know are preventable through proper hygiene practices. The connection between cleanliness and health was discovered very gradually, often through trial and error, rather than scientific understanding. Some communities may have noticed that certain practices seemed to lead to fewer illnesses, while others resulted in more sickness, but the underlying reasons remain mysterious for thousands of years. It's sobering to realize that these basic hygiene concepts that we take for granted today, the importance of washing hands, the need for clean water, the dangers of contamination, represent knowledge that humanity struggled to acquire over countless generations, often at tremendous cost in terms of suffering and death. That was quite a journey through some rather challenging historical territory, wasn't it? But I hope it hasn't been too uncomfortable for your peaceful evening wind down. Take a deep, cleansing breath now. Feel the softness of your comfortable surroundings. And perhaps take a moment to appreciate those pristine, white rolls of toilet paper waiting patiently in your bathroom. Such a simple thing, yet the result of thousands of years of human problem solving and technological development. In our next chapter, we'll move away from these more intimate aspects of daily life and explore something that might be more soothing to contemplate as you settle in for the night, the search for comfortable sleep itself. We'll discover what people used for beds before there were mattresses, how they stayed warm before central heating, and what their nights were really like in those long ago times. From straw and animal skins to cold earthen floors, the quest for a good night's sleep has its own fascinating and much more restful history to explore. After a long day of hunting through dense forests, gathering food from the wild, traveling across vast landscapes, or simply working hard to survive another day in an unforgiving world, every human body, then as now, craved the same thing: rest. Deep, restorative sleep that would rebuild strength, heal the day's small injuries, and prepare the mind and body for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. Today, we sink into carefully engineered mattresses with multiple layers of springs, memory foam, and specialized materials designed to cradle every curve of our bodies. We rest our heads on pillows filled with down or synthetic fibers that perfectly support our necks. We pull up soft blankets and comforters in rooms protected from wind and rain, from cold and heat, from every harsh element that nature might send our way. But what about our ancestors? Where did they find their rest when the sun disappeared behind distant hills and darkness settled over their world? How did they create comfort and safety in a time when both were precious and rare? Let's allow our imaginations to drift backward through time to those ancient evenings when the day's survival tasks were finally complete, when the fire had been built up for the night, when stomachs were as full as could be managed, and when tired bodies needed to find somewhere to lie down and rest. Picture yourself there, in that ancient world, as the light fades and the first stars begin to appear. You're exhausted from a day of constant physical effort. Your muscles ache from lifting, carrying, walking, climbing. Your body desperately needs sleep, but where will you find comfort? Where will you feel safe enough to close your eyes and let consciousness drift away? The search for a good night's sleep has been one of humanity's longest-running challenges. It might not seem as dramatic as finding food or avoiding predators, but comfortable rest was essential for health, for healing, for maintaining the strength needed to face each new day. Without proper rest, people became more vulnerable to injury, illness, and all the other dangers that surrounded them. And so, with the same ingenuity and determination that they brought to every other aspect of survival, our ancestors began the long process of learning how to create comfort and safety in sleep, using only what the natural world could provide. In the beginning, the most basic sleeping arrangement was, well, the ground itself. Picture this: a relatively flat patch of earth inside a protective cave, beneath a rocky overhang, or simply out in the open when weather and safety permitted. The floor of a cave, while offering protection from rain, wind, and many predators, was still essentially rock and packed earth. Cold, unyielding, and filled with bumps, stones, and uneven surfaces that would press uncomfortably against ribs, hips, and shoulders throughout the long night. Imagine lowering yourself onto such a surface after a day of exhausting work. Your body, already tired and aching, would immediately feel every pebble, every irregular contour of the cave floor. The stone would draw heat away from your body, leaving you chilled even on mild nights. And any movement during sleep would remind you, sometimes quite painfully, of exactly how unforgiving your sleeping surface really was. But humans have never been content to simply endure discomfort when they could find ways to improve their situation. Even in these earliest times, people began making small modifications to create slightly more comfortable resting places. They might search for natural depressions in the cave floor, places where the rock dipped down just enough to cradle a human body. Or they would use primitive tools and patient effort to gradually wear away high spots and rough edges, slowly creating smoother, more body-friendly sleeping surfaces. Some cave dwellers learned to build up low walls of stones around their sleeping areas, creating windbreaks that would keep the worst of the cold air from flowing directly over their bodies during the night. These stone enclosures also provided a psychological sense of security and personal space, even in the shared environment of a cave. When caves weren't available, or when people were traveling and had to sleep in the open, the challenges multiplied. The bare ground might be softer than cave floors, but it brought its own problems: moisture from dew or underground dampness, the risk of insects and small creatures, and complete exposure to changes in weather. People sleeping outdoors had to become experts at reading the sky and the wind, trying to predict whether the night would bring rain, frost, or dangerous temperature drops. They learned to position themselves near sources of warmth, close enough to a fire to benefit from its heat, but not so close as to risk burns or smoke inhalation. Perhaps most challenging of all was the vulnerability that came with sleep itself. When you're unconscious, you can't watch for predators, react to threats, or protect yourself from danger. This meant that choosing a sleeping location involved careful consideration of natural barriers, escape routes, and defensive positions. Some groups developed the practice of sleeping in shifts, with some members of the group staying awake to watch for threats while others rested. The responsibility would rotate throughout the night, ensuring that the group was never completely defenseless, but also ensuring that no one got a full night's uninterrupted sleep. Over time, ancient peoples began to understand that the quality of their rest directly affected their ability to survive and thrive. A person who slept poorly was more likely to make mistakes while hunting, more prone to injury, more susceptible to illness. This recognition gradually led to greater effort and innovation in creating better sleeping arrangements. They began to see comfortable sleep not as a luxury, but as a practical necessity for survival. This shift in thinking motivated them to invest time and energy in improving their sleeping conditions, even when other survival needs were pressing. To combat the discomfort and cold of sleeping directly on hard ground, our ancestors turned to one of nature's most abundant resources: plant materials. The forest floors, grasslands, and agricultural areas around them were filled with possibilities for creating softer, warmer sleeping surfaces. Dried leaves became one of the most important materials for creating primitive mattresses. But this wasn't simply a matter of raking together whatever leaves happened to be nearby. Through experience, some of it undoubtedly unpleasant, people learned to distinguish between leaves that made good bedding and those that were better avoided. The ideal leaves were large enough to create substantial cushioning, dry enough not to rot or develop mold, and free from the oils or textures that might cause skin irritation. Broad, deciduous leaves from trees like oak, maple, or similar species were often preferred because they maintained their shape well when dried and created relatively stable sleeping surfaces. Gathering bedding materials became a regular seasonal activity, much like collecting firewood or preserving food. In autumn, when leaves were falling naturally, people would collect the best specimens and carefully dry them in sunny, protected areas. The leaves needed to be completely moisture-free to prevent decay and the growth of harmful mold or bacteria. Can you imagine the satisfaction of preparing a fresh bed of leaves? The careful sorting through piles of collected foliage, selecting the largest and most intact pieces, discarding any that showed signs of disease or insect damage. Then the methodical arrangement of these leaves into thick, even layers that would provide cushioning throughout the night. Dried grasses and straw offered different advantages. When properly prepared, Grass could be woven or bundled together to create more structured bedding that wouldn't scatter as easily as loose leaves. Straw, when it became available through early agricultural practices, was particularly prized for its excellent insulation properties and its ability to spring back to shape after being compressed. The preparation of grass bedding was more labor-intensive than simply collecting leaves. Grass had to be cut at the right time of year, when it was mature but not yet too dry and brittle. It then needed to be carefully dried to prevent mold and often bundled or woven together to create cohesive mats that would stay in place throughout the night. Picture yourself settling down onto a fresh bed of carefully prepared plant materials. First, there would be the satisfying give and cushioning as your body pressed into the layered vegetation. The surface would feel notably softer and more forgiving than bare ground, cradling your hips and shoulders instead of pressing against them. The scent would be distinctly earthy and natural, the pleasant, clean smell of dried plants, perhaps with hints of the particular trees or grasses that had been used. This natural aromatherapy may have been one of the unexpected pleasures of these primitive sleeping arrangements. However, plant-based bedding came with its own set of problems that had to be managed carefully. Dried leaves and grass naturally attracted insects looking for shelter and food. Mice, rats, and other small creatures might nest in the comfortable bedding, leading to unpleasant surprises during the night. The bedding also compressed and scattered over time. A carefully arranged bed of leaves might provide excellent comfort for the first few nights, but would gradually break down and become thin and patchy. This meant that maintaining comfortable sleeping conditions required regular attention. Collecting fresh materials, rearranging compressed bedding, and completely replacing materials that had become too degraded to be useful. Different seasons offered different bedding opportunities and challenges. Spring brought fresh grasses, but also more moisture and the risk of mold. Summer offered the best drying conditions, but also the highest insect activity. Autumn provided the richest harvest of leaves and plant materials, but winter meant making do with whatever had been stored away during more abundant times. People in different climates and environments had to adapt their bedding strategies accordingly. Those in tropical areas might focus on materials that provided cooling and insect protection. People in colder regions prioritized insulation and warmth retention. Coastal peoples might use dried seaweed or other marine plants when land-based materials weren't available. As communities became more settled and agricultural practices developed, people gained access to more consistent supplies of straw and other cultivated plant materials. This led to the development of more sophisticated bedding systems, carefully woven grass mats, sewn together bundles of straw, and eventually the earliest versions of what we might recognize as primitive mattresses. When hunting skills developed and became more reliable, animal skins and furs transformed the ancient sleeping experience from mere survival to something approaching genuine comfort. These materials represented the first real luxury items in human sleeping arrangements: soft, warm, and wonderfully insulating. Large animal hides, when properly prepared and softened, could be spread over beds of straw or leaves to create a smooth, comfortable sleeping surface that was far superior to anything available before. The hide provided a barrier between the sleeper and the potentially scratchy or uneven plant materials below, while also adding its own cushioning and warmth. Picture the process of preparing these precious sleeping materials. After a successful hunt, the animal's hide would be carefully removed and then subjected to a long, labor-intensive preparation process. The skin would need to be scraped clean of any remaining flesh or fat, then softened through various techniques, perhaps by working natural oils into the surface or by repeatedly flexing and stretching the material until it became supple and comfortable against human skin. Fur pelts represented the absolute pinnacle of sleeping comfort for ancient peoples. A large bearskin, wolf pelt, or collection of smaller furs could transform a cold, miserable night into something genuinely cozy and pleasant. The insulating properties of fur are remarkable, trapping warm air close to the body while allowing moisture to escape, creating a microclimate of comfort even in harsh conditions. Imagine wrapping yourself in a well-prepared bearskin on a cold winter night. The dense fur would immediately begin trapping your body heat, creating a warm envelope around you. The natural oils in the fur would repel moisture from dew or light rain, and the substantial weight of the pelt would provide a sense of security and protection that thinner materials couldn't match. Different types of fur offer different advantages. The thick, dense fur of bears provided maximum warmth, but could be quite heavy. Wolf pelts were lighter and more manageable, while still offering excellent insulation. Smaller animals like rabbits or foxes might be sewn together to create larger sleeping covers, combining the softness of their fur with practical size considerations. The possession of high-quality fur bedding probably carried significant social meaning in ancient communities. A family or individual with multiple large pelts would have been obviously successful at hunting, and their superior sleeping arrangements would have been a visible sign of their skill and status. These valuable sleeping materials might be passed down through generations, carefully maintained and repaired to extend their useful life. A particularly fine bearskin or collection of pelts could represent wealth and security that lasted for many years, providing comfort night after night and serving as a tangible reminder of successful hunts and survival skills. However, animal skin bedding required careful maintenance to remain useful and pleasant. Inadequately prepared hides could develop unpleasant odors, attract insects, or become stiff and uncomfortable over time. Fur pelts needed to be kept clean and dry to prevent matting, mold, or the decay that would ruin their insulating properties. The care of these precious sleeping materials probably became a specialized skill within ancient communities. People learned techniques for cleaning furs without damaging them, for storing skins during wet weather, and for repairing tears or worn spots that developed through regular use. The availability of animal skin bedding fundamentally changed the sleeping experience for those fortunate enough to have access to it. Instead of simply enduring the night and hoping to get enough rest to function the next day, people could actually look forward to the comfort and warmth that their sleeping arrangements provided. This improvement in sleep quality had practical benefits that extended far beyond mere comfort. Better rest meant better health, sharper thinking, faster healing from injuries, and improved ability to handle the physical and mental demands of survival in a challenging world. As human societies develop more sophisticated tools and techniques, some communities began creating the first actual bed structures, raised platforms, and simple frames that lifted sleeping areas off the cold, damp ground and provided better protection from insects and small creatures. Raised earth platforms represented one of the earliest innovations in bed construction. People would carefully build up areas of soil and clay to create sleeping surfaces that were several inches higher than the surrounding floor. These platforms could be shaped to accommodate the human body, with slight depressions for hips and shoulders, raised areas for better head support, and even built-in drainage to prevent water accumulation. The construction of these earth beds required considerable skill and planning. The soil had to be carefully selected and compacted to create a stable surface that wouldn't crumble or develop uncomfortable lumps over time. Clay or other binding materials might be mixed in to improve durability. The final surface would be carefully smoothed and shaped, then covered with whatever bedding materials were available. As tool making advanced, some communities began constructing simple wooden bed frames, essentially raised platforms made from logs or branches that lifted the sleeping surface well off the ground. These early beds might consist of a basic framework of larger logs or branches, with smaller pieces laid across them to create a sleeping platform. The platform would then be covered with animal hides or woven grass mats to create a more comfortable surface, and topped with whatever bedding materials, straw, leaves, furs, the family could provide. While still quite primitive by modern standards, these raised beds represented a significant advancement in sleeping comfort and hygiene. Raising the sleeping surface off the ground provided several important advantages. It improved insulation by creating an air gap between the sleeper and the cold earth below. It provided better protection from moisture, insects, and small creatures that might otherwise share the sleeping space. And it created a sense of defined personal space and privacy, even in crowded living conditions. The psychological benefits of having an actual bed, a dedicated sleeping space that belonged to specific individuals or families, probably contributed significantly to feelings of security and well-being. The act of climbing into a raised bed, rather than simply lying down on the ground, created a clearer distinction between waking and sleeping time. The construction of bed frames required both materials and labor that not all families or communities could spare. As a result, having a raised bed probably became another marker of relative prosperity and success, similar to the possession of high-quality furs or other luxury items. In many ancient societies, and indeed in most human communities throughout history, the concept of individual sleeping spaces was quite different from what we're accustomed to today. Families, and sometimes even groups of unrelated people, commonly shared large sleeping areas or beds, huddling together for warmth, security, and efficient use of limited bedding materials. Family sleeping arrangements typically involved parents, children, and sometimes extended family members all sharing the same sleeping space. This wasn't simply a matter of limited space or resources, though those factors certainly played a role, but also a practical approach to staying warm and safe during vulnerable sleeping hours. In cold climates, shared body heat could mean the difference between comfortable sleep and potentially dangerous exposure to low temperatures. Multiple people sleeping together under shared furs or blankets could create a warm microenvironment that would be impossible for individuals sleeping alone to achieve. Sleeping in groups also provided important security advantages. There was safety in numbers, with multiple people available to wake and respond to threats during the night. The sounds and movements of several people sleeping together could also deter some predators or intruders who might approach a solitary sleeper. Group sleeping probably fostered strong social bonds and community feeling in ways that our modern emphasis on individual privacy doesn't encourage. Families that slept together would share dreams, provide comfort during nightmares or illness, and develop intimate knowledge of each other's sleep patterns and needs. The modern concept of personal sleeping space and privacy is actually quite recent in human history. For most of our ancestors, sleep was a communal activity that reinforced family bonds and community connections while serving practical purposes of warmth and protection. Large sleeping areas would be carefully organized to accommodate multiple people comfortably. Larger, stronger family members might sleep on the outside edges, where they could provide protection and respond to threats. Children and elderly family members would be positioned in the center, where they would be warmest and safest. The quest for peaceful sleep in ancient times was complicated by numerous threats and challenges that we rarely consider today. A comfortable bed was only part of the equation. People also had to find ways to sleep safely, despite the very real dangers that darkness could bring. Insects and parasites were perhaps the most constant nighttime irritation. Mosquitoes, fleas, ticks, and other biting insects were drawn to warm, sleeping bodies, and there were few effective ways to prevent their attacks. Some people learned to use smoke from certain plants to repel insects, or to cover themselves completely despite the resulting stuffiness and discomfort. Small animals, mice, rats, snakes, and other creatures might be attracted to the warmth of sleeping humans or to food scraps that remain near sleeping areas. Waking up to find an unwelcome visitor sharing your bed was probably a common and unpleasant experience. Weather changes during the night could transform a comfortable sleeping arrangement into a miserable ordeal. Sudden rain, wind, or temperature drops could leave people cold, wet, and unable to rest properly. Security concerns, the ever-present possibility of human threats or dangerous predators, meant that deep, restful sleep was always balanced against the need to remain somewhat alert to potential dangers. And so, we see how our ancestors gradually transformed the simple act of lying down to rest into something approaching the comfortable sleep experience we know today. From cold cave floors to soft animal furs, from shared sleeping spaces to individually crafted beds, the long journey toward comfortable rest reflects humanity's endless drive to improve life's daily experiences. Tonight, as you settle into your own comfortable bed with its soft mattress and cozy covers, you're participating in a tradition that stretches back to the very dawn of human civilization. The search for peaceful, restorative sleep that will prepare you for whatever tomorrow may bring. Sweet dreams. And so, our quiet journey through the more mundane, yet surprisingly fascinating corners of history draws gently to a close. We've traveled together through time, haven't we? Back to those misty mornings of human existence, discovering what our distant ancestors did before the simple luxury of a toothbrush. those not-so-pretty solutions that revealed such remarkable creativity in dealing with everyday discomfort. From chewed twigs that frayed into primitive brushes to sand and charcoal. We've also peered into a world before toilet paper existed, a world of leaves and moss, of water and stone, and those more firm choices that perhaps we never want to experience ourselves. But even in these intimate struggles, we saw the endless human drive to solve problems, to find comfort, to make life just a little bit more bearable. And finally, we explored the ancient quest for peaceful sleep itself, from cold earthen floors to the luxury of soft animal furs, from shared family sleeping spaces to those first raised beds that lifted people off the ground and closer to genuine comfort. These small stories, these everyday details, these fragments of ordinary life, they're the invisible threads that weave together the larger tapestry of human experience across the ages. Not the grand events that fill history books, but the quiet, persistent human effort to eat, to clean oneself, to rest, to simply live with a little more dignity and comfort, one small innovation at a time. Each scratch mark on those ancient teeth, each carefully prepared chew stick, each bed of dried leaves arranged with hope for a good night's sleep. They all tell the same story. Humans refusing to simply accept discomfort as inevitable, always reaching, always trying, always looking for ways to make tomorrow a little better than today. You know, after hearing these stories, perhaps you'll never look at the simple things around you in quite the same way again. That toothbrush sitting by your bathroom sink, those soft, precisely engineered bristles that clean so gently and thoroughly, represents thousands of years of human trial and error, of people learning through sometimes painful experience what works and what doesn't. The roll of toilet paper in your bathroom, so soft and clean and perfectly designed for its purpose, it's the answer to a problem that troubled humanity for millennia, the solution that countless generations could only dream of having. And your bed. Oh, your wonderful bed. As you settle deeper into that mattress tonight, with its carefully designed support and cushioning, covered by your soft sheets and warm blankets, in your private room protected from wind and cold and rain, you're experiencing a level of comfort that would have seemed absolutely magical to someone living just a few centuries ago, let alone thousands of years in the past. The comfort and convenience we take for granted didn't appear by magic. They're built on the accumulated wisdom, the experiments, the failures, and yes, sometimes the suffering of countless people who came before us. Every modern convenience represents someone, somewhere, who looked at a problem and said, there has to be a better way. Sometimes, looking back at the hardships and limitations of the past can help us feel lighter about our present lives, more grateful, more aware of just how fortunate we are to live in this particular moment in human history, when so many of life's basic challenges have been solved, when comfort and cleanliness and safety are not rare luxuries, but everyday realities. And perhaps that's one of the unexpected gifts of exploring these boring corners of history. They remind us that our ordinary lives today are actually quite extraordinary, filled with small miracles we rarely pause to notice. I hope these stories, despite their occasionally unusual subject matter, have served their intended purpose. That the slow, steady rhythm of discovery, the gentle pace of exploration through time, has helped you feel more relaxed, more ready for the peaceful sleep that awaits you. If your mind is still drifting along with images of miswak twigs or beds made of straw and animal furs, that's perfectly fine. Just let those thoughts float by gently, like clouds passing across a nighttime sky. Interesting to observe, but requiring no effort, no analysis, no memory. What matters most is that your body feels heavier now, more settled. You're breathing deeper and more regular. The day's tensions are melting away like morning mist, and you're ready to let go completely. The most important thing you can do now is simply let go. Let your mind drift wherever it wants to go. Let your body sink fully into the comfort of your bed, that miracle of modern engineering that cradles you so perfectly. Let the darkness be gentle and welcoming. You've earned this rest. You've made it through another day, solved your own problems, faced your own challenges. Now it's time to let sleep do its ancient work of healing and restoration. Now, it's truly time to rest, time to set aside all thoughts, all worries, all the busyness of the day, and simply allow yourself to be embraced by the quiet darkness. May your sleep tonight be deep and peaceful, untroubled by dreams. Or if dreams do come, may they be gentle ones, filled with comfort and light. May you wake tomorrow feeling refreshed and renewed, grateful for another day of this remarkable life you're living. I'm your companion in these gentle explorations of boring history that somehow helps the mind settle into sleep. I hope we'll meet again in future evenings to explore other quiet corners of the past, other forgotten details that connect us to the long human story of which we're all a part. If this is helpful to you, if these peaceful journeys through time bring you comfort, remember to follow along so you won't miss the next adventure. But that's tomorrow's consideration. Tonight, tonight, just sleep. Rest well, dear friend. Rest deeply. Let the soft darkness hold you safely until morning comes again.